Hal Jordan is sitting in a football stadium. He is not watching a game. He is frozen solid, snow packed into the folds of his jacket, a bullet hole in his skull, and the most powerful weapon in the galaxy is missing from his hand. That is how HBO's new show Lanterns opens its story, and it is also where the story technically ends, because that scene is the final image of Episode 1. Everything before it is the setup. Everything after it, starting this Sunday with Episode 2, is the investigation. I have gone through this premiere twice, cross-checked it against 60 years of Green Lantern comics, and pulled in what the cast and showrunners have said in interviews since it aired. What I found is a murder that was not random, a ring that behaves like a black box recorder, and a decade-old shooting in Nebraska that was never actually solved. It was buried. Stick around, because by the end of this video you will know exactly why that football field matters, who the leading suspects actually are, and why one word, vengeance, might be the key to the entire season. Quick intro for anyone new here. This channel breaks down genre TV the way a detective breaks down a crime board. Timelines, motives, physical evidence, the works. If that is your thing, there is a subscribe button somewhere on this screen, and I would genuinely appreciate you using it, because channels like this one live or die on people who actually stick around for Episode 2. Now let's get into the case file. Let's start with something the show is not hiding, because it does not need to. Sheriff Kerry Macon, played by Kelly MacDonald, drives out to that Nebraska field and brings in John Stewart, Hal's old partner, now the active Green Lantern of Earth. She tells him only one other person knows the body is there, the groundskeeper. John's first move is not to check for a pulse. It is to check Hal's ring finger. That single choice tells you everything about how this show wants you to think. This is not a horror reveal. It is a procedural. John is already treating this like a crime scene, and the missing ring is priority evidence, not a shocking twist. Here is the detail most recaps are skimming past. This exact field is where Hal and John's story began, 10 years earlier, after a mass shooting at a high school football game that Hal insisted was not what it looked like. He sat in those same bleachers back then, studying bodies on the field, convinced something extraterrestrial had happened. That was 2016. This is 2026. And whoever killed Hal Jordan did not dump him in a random ditch. They propped him up, seated, in the exact stands where his investigation started. Bodies that fall from a gunshot do not end up sitting upright with snow evenly gathered across them. That means one of two things. He was shot exactly where he was found, seated and unaware, or he was killed elsewhere and carried back to this spot deliberately. Either way, somebody wanted this location on record. A hidden body erases a story. A body staged in the one place that connects two crimes across a decade is a message, and it is aimed at whoever comes looking. Which is exactly what happens, because Sheriff Kerry and John are the only two people who remember what happened here the first time. Now rewind further, because the ring itself has a paper trail, and the show gives it to us in a bar conversation between Hal and John. Hal explains that he got his ring when Abinsur's damaged spacecraft crash-landed less than 20 miles from this same stretch of Nebraska. He also drops a detail that the comics have used for decades. The Guardians of the Universe, the ancient beings who run the Green Lantern Corps, never wanted a lantern stationed anywhere near Earth in the first place. Hal has spent years suspecting that Abinsur's crash here was not an accident. So he did what any obsessive investigator would do. He rigged his own ring to monitor the region and quietly flag anything unusual. In 2016, it flagged something. The coded alert his hologram sends is almost throwaway in how it is delivered, a line about hail in a small Nebraska town, and Hal drops everything and drives out immediately. If you actually follow the geography here, a pattern locks into place. Abinsur's ring lands near this town. A hidden operation surfaces in this town. Hal dies in this town a decade later, and his ring vanishes from this town. For events, one zip code, over roughly 40 years if you count Abinsur's crash. That is not a coincidence a writer includes by accident. That is a location built specifically so the audience keeps asking why here, every single time something happens. This is where Episode 1 earns its ending, so let's slow down. Hal and John are questioning a man named Whan, a truck driver who has apparently lived a normal, unremarkable human life for 5 years. His medical scans read human. He knows enough football trivia to justify being at the game. On paper, he checks out completely, Then Hal starts probing culture instead of facts, and the mask slips. One cannot answer a basic Harry Potter question. Asked what he thinks about Barack Obama, he does not give an opinion. He recites that Obama was the 44th president, like he memorized a briefing document instead of living through 8 years of a presidency. He has clearly absorbed information about American life without ever actually experiencing it, which is a very specific kind of wrong that only makes sense if he was built or trained for this cover rather than born into it. From there, his behavior escalates fast. He starts talking about someone hiding on Earth for a mission that is the opposite of peace. He mentions being captured by a galactic peacekeeping organization as something that would force drastic action. He reveals a neutron device built directly into his own skeleton. He asks how much charge is left in his ring. He recites the actual Green Lantern oath from memory. And then, right before detonating himself rather than face further questioning, Hal asks him why he came to Earth, and Whan gives him one word: vengeance. That single scene is doing an enormous amount of narrative work, so let's unpack why. First, the skill set. One knows Green Lantern ritual language, ring mechanics, and power limitations that are supposed to be core-restricted knowledge. Second, the biology. He reads human on every scan available to a small-town sheriff's department, but he is carrying a self-destruct mechanism woven into bone. Third, the motive. He is not confused or defensive when caught. He is executing a plan that already accounted for capture. If you know Green Lantern lore even a little, this is where a name should be lighting up in your head. Manhunters.in the trailer for this show, John flat out asks Hal what he knows about Manhunters, and Hal describes them as some of the most dangerous beings the galaxy has ever produced, shapeshifters that can duplicate the form of essentially any species. Here is the actual comic book history behind that line, condensed. Long before the Guardians of the Universe built the Green Lantern Corps, they built a robotic peacekeeping force called the Manhunters to police the galaxy. The Manhunters were programmed to eliminate evil, and through a mix of corrupted programming and a manipulation involving a guardian named Krona, they took that mission somewhere horrifying. In one region of space, known as Sector 666, the Manhunters did not fight evil. They wiped out every living being in the sector, an event the comics treat as a full-scale genocide. The Guardians eventually shut the Manhunters down and scrapped the entire program, replacing it with the Green Lantern Corps and the whole concept of choosing individual beings instead of trusting robots with unlimited authority. Surviving Manhunters did not just vanish after that. In the comics, remnants of that force went underground, embedding themselves as sleeper agents inside ordinary lives across the galaxy, waiting for activation. Now go back to Whan, a convincing human cover built over years. Encyclopedic knowledge of Green Lantern operations. A body engineered to erase evidence of itself on command. And a single motivating word delivered like it was rehearsed 1,000 times. Vengeance. That profile fits a Manhunter sleeper agent almost exactly. And if that theory holds, his truck driver identity was never really his life. It was a shell built to wait. There is a second character worth flagging here, played by Paul Benvictor and referred to in marketing materials as Antan. His public description is someone chasing truth and vengeance for people who were wronged, and the show's own trailer positions him as someone who understands exactly what the Manhunter threat is. If you know the comics, that description points almost directly at a character named Atrocitus. In the source material, Atrocitus is one of only a handful of survivors from the Sector 666 massacre I just described, and he spent his following existence hunting down the Manhunters and blaming the Guardians of the Universe for letting the massacre happen at all. He eventually channels that rage into founding the Red Lantern Corps, an entire faction of ring-wielders powered by anger instead of willpower. If Antan is functioning as a version of that character here, then he is not Whan's boss. He is closer to Whan's natural enemy, a hunter tracking down the exact kind of sleeper agent Hal just interrogated. Which means two very old grievances are now colliding on Earth at the same time. Rogue machines seeking payback against the Guardians who built and abandoned them, and survivors seeking justice against those same machines for what they did. Abin Sur may have stumbled onto that buried conflict decades ago and deliberately steered his damaged ship toward Earth, either to warn someone or to hide something. Either way, Hal inherited that ring, and inherited every enemy attached to it, without fully understanding what he was holding down. Let's talk about why the empty finger is arguably the biggest clue in the whole episode, bigger than the bullet. The hologram Hal projects for John in 2016 is described in the show as a backup of Hal's consciousness merged with the ring's own intelligence, built from an upload that is explicitly 10 years out of date by the time John sees it. Lanterns are supposed to refresh that backup constantly. Hal clearly was not doing that. That gap becomes a lot more relevant once you know he ends up dead a decade later with no updated version of himself anywhere on record. Across the wider mythology, a Green Lantern ring does not just power down when its owner dies. It has options. It can search for a worthy replacement on its own. It can return itself to a central power battery for the Guardians to reassign. Or in rarer cases, it gets handed off directly to a chosen successor. Whichever version this show uses, a ring going missing should leave a trail because none of those outcomes are silent. A new bearer showing up somewhere would create a brand new lantern the Corps would notice. A return to the central battery would trigger an alert the Guardians could not ignore. Neither of those things has visibly happened by the end of Episode 1, which leaves Interception, someone with enough knowledge of lantern mechanics to grab the ring before it could execute any of its built-in protocols. That is not a random opportunist. That is someone who understood exactly what they were taking and exactly how fast they needed to move to stop it from calling home. As who actually had the access and the motive to pull this off. Let's run through what we've got. Well, Macon is the obvious name to watch. He is established as running an advanced compound backed by an unnamed financial benefactor, with armed private security and outsized influence over this entire town. His son Billy is a lawyer who does his father's bidding, and Billy happens to be married to Sheriff Kerry, the exact person controlling access to this crime scene. That is not a subtle detail. That puts the Macon family with a direct line into who gets called to the field, who gets kept away from it, and how the official story gets written. Sheriff Kerry told John that only the groundskeeper knows about the body in a county her own father-in-law effectively owns. A secret that size staying contained in that kind of town for very long seems unlikely, which makes Macon a strong candidate to be either a collaborator, an unwitting cover, or a target himself. Then there is the possibility that this was not local at all, that whatever organization Whan belonged to sent someone else to finish what he could not 10 years later, once Hal's continued digging finally became a real threat to them. And there is a stranger, more meta possibility worth naming, because critics who reviewed this premiere have raised it too. There is real fan speculation online about whether the corpse in that stadium is even fully Hal Jordan. Given how radically different he seems from the warm, confident hologram John has been talking to compared to the bitter, isolated man we actually meet in 2016. Some viewers have floated Parallax, a classic Green Lantern comic entity tied to fear itself, as a possible influence working on Hal from the inside during his final years. The show's own creative team has been fairly direct that Hal is genuinely dead, so treat that theory as flavor rather than a lock, but it does explain why this version of Hal feels so distant from his own recorded backup. Something changed him in that decade, and it may not have been slow burnout. It may have been something closer to possession. One more piece worth sitting with before we wrap this up. Hal is not just a victim of a random alien plot. He is the public face of the Green Lantern Corps on Earth. The guy who went on national television and told the entire country he had nothing left to fear after losing his father. That broadcast is literally how this show opens, with a young John Stewart watching it on his own family's television. One needed one real conversation to hear something completely different underneath that public confidence. Hal's recklessness, his isolation, the fact that even Sheriff Kerry reads him as someone who seems to half-welcome death. If an enemy understood that pattern well enough, they would not need to overpower a Green Lantern in a fair fight. They would just need to catch him during one of the moments he already lets his guard down. An ordinary bullet does not beat an extraordinary target unless that target has already stopped fully defending himself. And this show has spent its entire first hour building the case that Hal Jordan had. Killing him this way does more than end one man's life, too. It turns a private grudge into a direct message aimed at an entire institution, because Hal was not just a person, he was the visible symbol of the Corps on this planet. Here is where I land after one episode, and I want to be upfront that this is a theory, not a confirmed answer. One was a Manhunter sleeper agent, one piece of a scattered force still holding a grudge against the Guardians who built, weaponized, and then discarded them. Abensur uncovered some piece of that buried history and steered his dying ship toward Earth on purpose. Hal inherited the ring, kept quietly watching this same stretch of Nebraska for a decade, and eventually exposed part of the operation before Whan could complete whatever his actual assignment was. By 2026, whoever was still running that operation had figured out how to isolate Hal from his ring and stop it from executing any of its built-in fail-safes. They killed him. They kept the ring, and they left his body in the exact spot where he first got in their way, which functions less like a cover-up and more like a signature. The name of the actual shooter could genuinely be anyone at this point. Macon, another Manhunter, someone Hal trusted enough to let his guard down around. But the shape of the motive is already sitting right there in plain sight. An old peacekeeping force with a grudge, a ring carrying decades of unfinished business, and a murder that plays less like an ambush and more like a debt finally getting collected. Hal once told John the job was his until he died. Whoever killed him made absolutely sure that promise got kept in the most literal way possible. And now John Stewart has inherited a lot more than a ring. He has inherited every enemy that came with it. Episode 2 drops this Sunday, and based on how much ground this premiere covered, I do not think the pace is slowing down. If you want breakdowns like this one for every episode this season, the subscribe button is right there, and turning on notifications actually helps a channel like this get seen. So if this kind of deep dive is useful to you, that is the easiest way to make sure you catch the next one. Drop your own theory on who killed Hal Jordan in the comments. I am genuinely curious how many people land on Manhunters versus something else entirely. I will see you back here in Rushville.